The influence of William Shakespeare on J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings cannot be overstated, with one of the trilogy's most important events being directly inspired by the legendary playwright. Despite this, it may come as a surprise that Shakespeare and especially his works and legacy were heavily disliked by his fellow legend of English literature, J.R.R. Tolkien himself. To understand Tolkien's dislike of Shakespeare, however, let us first explore Tolkien's experience with his works, as well as their impact on the Lord of the Rings. While still a young boy, like countless others of his age and background, J.R.R. Tolkien would be immersed in Shakespeare's works and taught them extensively during his school years. At first glance, and knowing his fascination with English history and language, you might imagine that Tolkien would have an affinity for Shakespeare, but the reality is quite the opposite. In fact, while still in King Edward's school, as a teenager within the debating society, Tolkien is remembered for his highly passionate and critical stance against William Shakespeare in one of the society's events. The school's newspaper would go on to record that Tolkien had poured a sudden flood of unqualified abuse upon Shakespeare, upon his filthy birthplace, his squalid surroundings, and his sordid character. Apparently, in that debate, he had argued in favor of the position that the works traditionally attributed to Shakespeare were actually written by Sir Francis Bacon, in what was a relatively common theory believed by some in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Although the extent of Tolkien's actual belief in this conspiracy is very limited, and Tolkien himself was likely made to support that position as part of the school debate, through his later writings we can see that his dislike of Shakespeare, that was first recorded through this debate in the 1910s, is actually true. The question is, why? Well, in Tolkien's own words in letter 163, the professor recounts his bitter disappointment at how the plot of Shakespeare's Macbeth played out, and how the prophecy that is so central to the story's plot was, in Tolkien's eyes, resolved in a cheap and downright unskillful way. This feeling that Shakespeare's storytelling was not particularly good and somewhat unsatisfying in certain of his most famous plays persisted throughout his life, and it would serve as the first and arguably most important source of Tolkien's dislike of Shakespeare, at least in his earlier years. In his famous essay on fairy stories, the professor states that to be dissolved or to be degraded is the likely fate of fantasy when a dramatist tries to use it, even such a dramatist as Shakespeare. Macbeth is indeed a work by a playwright who ought, at least on this occasion, to have written a story if he had the skill or patience for that art. Tolkien disliked how the story of Macbeth played out so much that he admitted to have written major parts of The Lord of the Rings as a correction to Shakespeare, which I will explain soon. Beyond that, Tolkien believed that Shakespeare's works were at their best when they were being performed, and in letter 76, he goes into detail about a production of Hamlet that he had particularly enjoyed, emphasizing, however, how different his feelings were when simply reading the written word of William Shakespeare. While this is a relatively popular opinion, and not at all surprising for a work of art written with theatre specifically in mind, it is directly connected with one of Tolkien's main issues with Shakespeare. In On Fairy Stories, Tolkien goes into detail about his belief that fantasy's true home is literature, and no other medium could adequately portray this genre that he adores so deeply in a way that would do it justice. In human art, fantasy is a thing best left to words, to true literature. It is a misfortune that drama, an art fundamentally distinct from literature, should so commonly be considered together with it or as a branch of it. Among these misfortunes we may reckon the depreciation of fantasy. But drama is naturally hostile to fantasy. Fantasy, even of the simplest kind, hardly ever succeeds in drama when that is presented as it should be, visibly and audibly acted. Fantastic forms are not to be counterfeited. Men dressed up as talking animals may achieve buffoonery or mimicry, but they do not achieve fantasy. For Tolkien, Shakespeare's plays contain so much of the fantastical, of witches and of magic, prophecies and elves, that it may be mistaken for fantasy, and that this would be only in the detriment of fantasy. He sees Shakespeare's medium as something that hurts the genre to the point of debasement, making a fool of it when, instead, it should be something better revered, more serious and spiritual. Tolkien believes that it is impossible to capture the true essence of fantasy through a visual medium such as a theatre production, and that regardless of how good the effects were, there would be nothing in comparison to the imagination of someone reading the fantasy on page. Essentially, genuine fantasy, according to Tolkien, is something that should exist within the mind, within the, well, fantasy of the reader. With Shakespeare, he sees the fantasy portrayed in a written form not good enough, with a story that is unfulfilling and ultimately made for a medium that cannot do it proper justice, something he goes into further detail in his essay. A reason more important, I think, that the inadequacy of stage effects is this. Drama has, of its very nature, always attempted a kind of bogus, or shall I say at least substitute, magic. The visible and audible presentation of imaginary men in a story. That is, in itself, an attempt to counterfeit the magician's wand. To make such a thing may not be impossible. I have never seen it done with success. But at least it cannot be claimed as the proper mode of drama, in which walking and talking people have been found to be the natural instruments of art and illusion. For this precise reason, that the characters and even the scenes are in drama not imagined but actually beheld, drama is, even though it uses a similar material, words, verse and plot, an art fundamentally different from narrative art. Thus, if you prefer drama to literature, or form your critical theories primarily from dramatic critics or even from drama, you're apt to misunderstand pure story making and to constrain it to the limitations of stage plays. You are, for instance, likely to prefer characters, even the basest and dullest, to things. Very little about trees, as trees can be got into a play. Essentially, fantasy is meant to be literature and not theater. Shakespeare's literature was not something he enjoyed, preferring his works to be performed. But since fantasy should not be performed, he ultimately did not enjoy Shakespeare's attempt at fantasy, as well as its legacy. Moving away from his dislike of Shakespeare's works on a theoretical and literary level, Tolkien also held a gripe specifically about two different things. The first is the damage that he felt Shakespeare had done to his beloved elves in the popular imagination, and the second is, as I mentioned, the prophecy of Macbeth. Starting with the elves, Tolkien viewed works such as A Midsummer Night's Dreams and especially The Merry Wives of Windsor as proliferating the idea that the elves, a mythical race he loved deeply, were these whimsical creatures, completely detached from their spiritual and even ethereal origins in the Middle Ages, and especially the medieval interpretations of Norse mythology. In Tolkien's mind, Shakespeare and his widespread influence in the English-speaking world and beyond was an important reason why the elves came to be viewed the way they were by the 20th century, influencing generation after generation of writers in a process that climaxed during the Victorian era and oversaw the complete intertwining of the elves with stories made for children. The professor goes so far as to say in letter 151 that, "I now deeply regret having used elves, though this is a word in ancestry and original meaning suitable enough, but the disastrous debasement of this word, in which Shakespeare played an unforgivable pan, has really overloaded it with regrettable tones, which are too much to overcome." From this quote, you can perhaps see a parallel with his opinions on Walt Disney, as I have covered before, and how the works of the Disney company, according to Tolkien, negatively influenced people's perception of the dwarfs, dumbing them down and turning them into what he felt was essentially a joke, removed from its supernatural and mythological origins. Tolkien expands on the effect that Shakespeare had on the elves within the footnote of letter 131, in which, in reference to the elves, he states, "Intending the word to be understood in its ancient meanings, which continued as late as Spenser, a murrain on William Shakespeare and his damned cobwebs." Murrain, for those unfamiliar, means something along the lines of the plague. Despite everything so far, and perhaps even because of everything so far, The Lord of the Rings, by Tolkien's own admission, was directly impacted by the professor's dislike of Shakespeare's work. Going back to the prophecy of Macbeth, it is said within the story that Macbeth himself is prophesied to be killed only when Birnam Wood, the forest itself, travels all the way to Dunsinane, and moreover, that no man born of woman would be able to kill him. Two paradoxical things for very obvious reasons. While originally reading the story, Tolkien seemed to enjoy it until the twist of the prophecy was finally revealed. Essentially, the forest was able to travel to Dunsinane because it was cut down and brought over, and the one to kill him was born out of a C-section. At that point, Tolkien was disappointed completely, and especially at the first reveal regarding the woods. He was disgruntled and he felt that such an incredible opportunity was missed by not having the trees themselves march to their destination, by Shakespeare not allowing this part of the story the mystical and the supernatural that Tolkien felt it deserved. I personally thought it was an interesting turn of events, which reminded me of the ambiguity of ancient Greek prophecies, but I digress. The point is that he hated this decision so intensely that, decades after he first read Macbeth, when he was writing The Lord of the Rings, he made his wish a reality and had the trees, the Ents, march to war and destroy Isengard themselves. In the footnote of letter 163, he elaborates, "Their pan in the story is due, I think, to my bitter disappointment and disgust from school days with the shabby use made in Shakespeare of the coming of great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill. I longed to devise a setting in which the trees might really march to war." Lastly, regarding the other part of the prophecy, Glorfindel prophesies that no man shall kill the Witch King. The witches prophesied that no man born of a woman shall kill Macbeth. Eowyn, a woman, kills the Witch King alongside Mary, a hobbit. No man did kill the Witch King after all. Macduff, according to Shakespeare, was not born of woman as he was ripped from her womb. Therefore, he was able to defeat Macbeth. While on the surface these two cases may seem similar, they're actually quite different. Whereas for Tolkien, Shakespeare's prophecy turns out to be a cheap loophole, within The Lord of the Rings, the Witch King's doom is resolved in a different way. The real reason why the Witch King died is not because non-men killed him, but because the sword that Mary stabbed him with, made by the men of Númenor, was able to sever his connection to Sauron and weaken him, which then permitted these two non-men to kill him, but not because they were not men. It was not resolved due to a loophole. The prophecy did not come to pass for the sake of coming to pass. Tolkien wanted his world to have meaning and impact, for Middle-earth to make sense and to be consistent down to the most minute detail, and he went to great lengths in order to achieve that goal, while also managing to maintain elements of mysticism, mystery, and the supernatural. Nonetheless, it should be mentioned that, unlike with the Ents, Tolkien never commented on the Eowyn part of Macbeth, though as you can see, there are some very strong arguments to be made. Overall, as with anything, the truth lies somewhere in the middle, and Shakespeare's influence, both direct and indirect, on all works made in the English language cannot be overstated. The rustic feeling of the Shire, the influences of King Lear, and the very poetry of Middle-earth, as well as the feelings produced by the people of Arda, may all find some of their origins back to William Shakespeare. And Tolkien, while he did use a certain type of language to describe the bard, must have certainly had a level of appreciation for both him and some of his works, despite his more apparent criticisms, at least in my opinion. With that said, I hope now you have a better understanding of J.R.R. Tolkien's opinions on Shakespeare, as well as his beliefs on what makes a good story and how fantasy in general should be treated. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.